we have got a terrific guest on the show today, and I'm very happy and glad that he's joining us. Josh Tsui is a game developer. He worked at Midway during the 90s, worked on games like Fight Night and Tony Hawk, and had a very nice career making games for a long time, and he's not done yet. But what he's done recently is kind of shift his focus to build a documentary that I firmly believe in. It's all about the history of Midway. We're going to show you a little bit of the doc, and we're going to talk about the history of Midway and what Josh has been up to. But ladies and gentlemen, Josh Tsui is with us. How are you, my friend?
Good. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you for joining us, Josh. And I think what we should do is give people a little taste of what your work has been the last little while. And we've got a clip. Do you mind setting it up for us?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So what you're going to see here is there was a game that Williams made in the very late 80s called Narc. And in many ways, this was the return of the arcade. And a lot of people know that the arcades kind of had a downfall in the early to mid 80s.
Yeah.
And so Williams wanted to make this game called Narc that kind of brought them back. And this clip that you're going to see here is basically the developers trying to figure out how violent this game should be. And it basically sets the tone for the entire 90s output from Midway Games at that time.
Awesome. Let's take a look.
I did have a question. At that point, we had filmed a few characters, we had filmed the environments, and I asked, okay, a rocket launcher is one of your weapons now. And I said, okay, when a player fires the rocket launcher, what happens? And people said, what do you mean? I go, well, I can make it look real. These are real people. The mission was to, make it look real.
Body parts would fly. I mean, I guess this was one of the first, body part games. I think maybe the first.
I remember George was like, God, this is so cool. I can't believe this is so cool. And I came up and I was really being very gentle about it. I just said, I mean, it is cool, but do you think that's a good thing to put in an arcade where little kids are there?
That's one of my gaming heroes in that clip there. That's Eugene Jarvis, who made my favorite arcade game of all time, Robotron 2084. But Josh, tell us who some of those other people were, some of those other faces in that clip.
Yeah, besides Eugene Jarvis, there was Jack Hager, who at the time was the art director at Williams, which eventually became Midway later on.
Yeah.
He was known previously for creating, being one of the creators of Sinistar, which is one of my favorite Williams games.
Oh, I love that game.
And then the other person was Warren Davis, who was the creator of Qbert, who was also a programmer at Williams.
Oh my God!
Crazy. So it just shows you that this company, even early on, had just gods working there.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really amazing to be amongst these people, and that's why I always thought that it would be a great documentary to make.
When did you start at Midway, and what was your first game that you worked on over there?
Yeah, my first game, I started, I always forget if it's 92 or 93. It was somewhere in there. I think it was early 93.
Yeah.
And the very first game I worked on was with the NBA Jam team, which was WrestleMania, the arcade game.
Oh, great.
So that team had just come off of the first NBA Jam, hugely successful game. And one of the designers was a big wrestling fan. And at that point, Mortal Kombat had already come out, so they thought, well, let's do a wrestling game with the same style as Mortal Kombat. And I ended up getting hired as a just all-around general artist on the project.
That's cool. How did the WrestleMania game do? Was it a success for Midway?
As an arcade game, it was a moderate success. It wasn't nearly as big as NBA Jam or Mortal Kombat at the time.
Yeah.
But it found really good success on the home market. Acclaim did a great job of marketing it. I think it was one of the launch titles for the PlayStation 1, so it did extremely well there. And it's funny, over 20 years later, people still bring that game up. And I think it's aged better now. I played it recently. It's I think I had more fun playing it now because there's some distance from the Mortal Kombat games now from it. Because before it came out right after Mortal Kombat.
Yes.
And it was just too much of a comparison.
Yeah, you're mentioning some of these massive icons, even the idea of Acclaim being gone as well, it's just so surreal that these massive behemoth industries or, chunks of the industry can just disappear like that. How did Midway sort of self-destruct? What happened with this company?
I mean, there's no real one thing, but one of the things that kind of shifted a lot of the energy away was, towards the late 90s, the consoles just became really powerful. Back in the day, the arcade machines were always at the top of the food chain. They had the most power. The hardware was made specifically for that one game. So, I mean, they were just doing crazy things.
Yeah.
And then the PlayStation 1 comes out, and it was pretty good. There was a lot of 3D power on there. But it really wasn't until the PlayStation 2 came around. And all of a sudden, it was, people were like, wait a second, this thing is as good as what I'm seeing in the arcade.
Yeah.
And I have to drop in a quarter every 20 seconds. So it started shifting things around. And when you got that power at home, why would you want to leave home?
Yeah, totally. And it's not like Midway didn't have a great long run either, right? Like we talk about Midway, and I think your doc kind of focuses on the 90s, but Midway was there as Williams, as the pinball machine company for decades. And then it also had a great run as a video game brand in the 80s before, NBA Jam and Mortal Kombat and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, that's the thing is that, Williams had this incredible run in the early 80s with Eugene Jarvis doing games like Defender sold 55,000 machines. Now think about that, 55,000 machines, and each machine was around like $3,000 to $4,000.
Yeah.
So that's a massive hit.
Yes.
And then the arcades died, came back in the 90s, but then when the arcades died again in the 90s, Midway had a pretty good run in the home market for a while, up until I think they closed they went bankrupt in 2008.
Yeah.
So that company has had a lot of different chapters, and just for myself, the 90s for me was an easy thing because I was there at the time, so it was something that I can really sink my teeth into. But there are a lot of stories before and after.
And so let's talk about that. And I want to talk about, because obviously you've made a lot of friendships and you've got this incredible access. And I, for one, just am so excited that these stories are being told, because I feel like we live in this society of, especially with games, where there's a disposability and we just move on and we never think about who makes them or the craft that goes into this stuff. But take me and us into walking through the halls and working at Midway in the 90s. What was it like?
Wow, that is it's kind of nuts. It's not anything like you would experience now. The video game department at Williams Valley Midway was literally a space that was in the back of a pinball factory.
Okay.
So when you say walking through the hallways, you're not walking through the hallway. You're walking through a giant assembly line of pinballs being made, and so you're seeing hundreds and hundreds of people making these machines. You go all the way in the back, and now you have this cubicle land of with what looks like a tent city of homeless people, and that's the video game department. So that's what always blew my mind. Even back then, I thought to myself, wow, there are these video game developer gods working on these games, and NBA Jam just hit, Mortal Kombat had just hit and stuff, and then you see this it looked like a bomb shelter that you're working with. But that's always been one of our jokes, during that period was, our conditions were so miserable that's why the games came out so good. Like Midway Games during that era they were like gritty and aggressive, and we didn't care about the rules and stuff. But, in the documentary, Ernest Cline, who wrote Ready Player One, he stood up best. He said Midway Games in the 90s was like the punk rock of video games, and that's how it was. It was just like, just do it and ask for forgiveness later.
Well, you guys were kind of like the Detroit Pistons, I think, in the 80s as well, right? You're just like rough and tumble. You're so correct. But I think in that, trying to kind of make your own way, you guys innovated, and you just came up with you broke so many rules, like putting full motion video into a video game that you would see at the arcade. I mean, I remember seeing Mortal Kombat and going, how is this? How can they do this? How am I controlling this video guy? It was surreal, and I guess you had to learn new things like crazy there, right?
Yeah, I mean, like techniques were being made up on the spot. So like we talk, in the clip you saw, Narc really catapulted everything forward. The hardware made for Narc, the digitizing process for Narc, and everything like that. That's Mortal Kombat came out of that. NBA Jam came out of that. But with each game, the hardware would change a little bit, the techniques would change, and the rules were always being adjusted for new things. And in the case of Mortal Kombat, you have things that there were other games that did digitization, but nobody put as much care into making the digitized images look really good as much as the Midway artist did. So there's a lot of this. It sounds stereotypical, but it's almost like this Midwestern work ethic of just crafting something until it's just as polished as possible, and that's the way the mentality was.
I visited Midway, I think in 2000, could have been 2000 or 2001, and it was like Mortal Kombat 4 time frame, and by that point, you guys had fully adopted the sort of console development skew, and it was a bigger. It wasn't the tent city thing like you're describing right there. There was more of a move towards actually having a full-fledged video game studio. But what struck me, I mean, I met Turmel there, Mark Turmel, who was the head on NBA Jam, and I met Eugene Jarvis, and I've interviewed him many times. But there was a lot of really big success there, but there was an attitude that I saw, and it might have been just for the cameras and just for the press, but it felt like we were all in it together. I didn't really get a sense of like the star system at Midway. Was it a pretty flat hierarchy? Did you guys all feel like you could chip in and contribute in tons of different ways?
Yeah, it was very flat. I mean, it was almost ridiculously flat.
Yeah.
And the teams were small, so everybody did a little bit of everything. These guys like Turmel and Boone and everyone else, they were hugely successful. But yeah, if you saw them in the hallway, you would have no idea.
Yeah.
Because people, when you're at the studio or at the office, it's all about the work. Nobody has airs or anything like that. There was great rivalry between the teams, though.
Yeah.
And that's one of the more interesting things is that it was like this weird dichotomy of everybody was super friendly to each other, but they really competed against each other, and that really made some great games. And but again, going back to that flat hierarchy, later on when you get to Midway doing more and more home games and teams start getting bigger and games start getting bigger, that flat hierarchy started to kind of betray itself a little bit. Yes. And get made it a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, because suddenly you were competing against other studios that had a more regimented system, and the games became much more expensive and more detailed. You mentioned Ed Boon, and he's a guy that I've known for almost 25 years. I interviewed him for the first time I went to E3 in '95, and he's always been the same genuine, down-to-earth guy. And the thing that I love about him is that every time he comes out with a successful game, which is every time he comes out with a game, he thanks everybody on the team in different ways, in messages and con panels and stuff like that. But he names them and he shows people's work. He's one of the greats, man. Like one of the great people that I've known in the games industry over the years. Was that kind of the attitude by the lifers at Midway, the people that are, still making games and have kind of moved on and learned all of their lessons from Midway?
Yeah, everyone's still, despite all the success and everything, everybody is, they still have the same attitude as they had before, which is, hey, we make games. We're just lucky that we're making games and making a living out of it and having fun with it.
Yeah.
I was just recently out in San Diego visiting Mark Turmel, and Mark's been successful well before Midway. I mean, he was making great games when he was 18 years old and stuff. And I visited his beautiful house in San Diego and stuff, and he's amazingly successessul. But we're out getting a cheap burger somewhere.
Yeah.
Telling me, hey, you know what? Don't tell my wife I had a burger because I'm supposed to be eating a salad.
Yeah.
Things like that. So everyone's just very normal.
I mean, that's one of the things that's kept me doing what I do, for 25 years now. It's that accessibility and that willingness to talk, and I think the importance that people recognize in sharing some of these stories, and like that must have been something that struck you as well. Like you have shifted your whole sort of focus, your career focus in this direction. That's not easy to do in any career, but it must have been an overwhelming sensation for you. You must have realized, look, these stories are going to pass us by if we don't stop and talk about them, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. I mean, it's, even when I was working there, I felt kind of the weight of history while I was there because just things were just happening a lot. And so, over the years, I've always kind of kept that in me. I always thought, what, there's such a great group of characters, and great situations that would come up. And so it was so I had this idea to do this film for a really long time. And then around 2015, I started to realize that, what, if I don't do this, somebody else is going to do it.
Yeah.
And somebody else is probably going to really mess it up,
Yeah.
Just not at the right point. So that kind of kicked me in the butt to just kind of, let's just get the process going. So I had, so I basically was working on it part-time while I was doing other things for, over a year and a half. And then about, almost a year ago, I started realizing that, hey, I have something really great here. I had done all the interviews already. I was starting to see the story form. And I just felt like, what, to do this justice, I need to spend a lot of time on it. So I just decided I'm just going to work on this full time and just really, blast it through, get it crafted, get a great story together, and just get it done. So that's been my life for like almost a year now.
That's
because
awesome.
I just felt, it just got to a point where I felt like, hey, it deserves the time at this point that I just to get it done.
100%, Josh. Are you? Is it mostly you as the full-time crew on this? Do you go out and shoot everything and sit behind the camera? And are you lighting?
Yeah. For the most part, it's been myself. I've had help on some of the shoots where if it's easy for me to get a mini crew together, I'll get that together.
Yeah.
I've been getting some editing help, motion graphics and such. I've been doing most of the editing myself up to this point, but it'll get to a point where then I pass it off to a real editor to then go in and polish things up, maybe move things around that he or she feels is needed. And go
Dude,
from
you're
there.
an inspiration. And honestly, there's going to be a lot of people watching this right now that are kind of trying to figure out where they're going with their life. And here's a guy that's been making games for 20 years and says, "No, I want to be a filmmaker." And you're teaching yourself as you go, and the technology is so available, right? Like you can get
that's a crazy thing. Like, even as recent as 5 years ago, I don't think this would have been possible.
Right.
But when I really, like I said, a couple of years ago, when I really looked at the landscape, it's like, all right, here's how much this equipment costs. Here are my resources. And when I really looked at that, I realized, man, this isn't like when I was going to film school in college where it was just, everything was way too hard to do.
Yeah.
So, I got some pointers. I asked for advice. I've been talking with other documentarians and just kind of learning as I go. YouTube has an amazing, amount of resources for first-time filmmakers. And I just studied up as I went along. And even as I'm editing, when I run into a problem, I'll look something up real quick and find the answers instantly. So it's an amazing time to create stuff like this.
Yeah, and I think what you're doing too also speaks to the importance of recognizing that kernel of an idea and jumping on it. Don't letting it pass by. Right? Like this is something that absolutely will get told. You're 100% right. And honestly, you'll come out with insert coin, and then someone's probably going to get inspired and say, well, let me go back and do more on this or whatever, But I think that what you're doing is such an important part of sort of the creative world right now is you just have to go. You have to make it. You got to just do it. There's really nothing holding us back anymore, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's one of my favorite YouTubers, and I was on a panel with them a few years ago. It was Casey Neistat.
Yeah.
And his whole thing is just do things, that you want to do. I think the slogan is, do the things that you can do. And I think that's exactly it. Nowadays, there's just no excuse not to try something out. Make the mistakes, and then do it again. Just keep iterating on things.
Well, I'm going to ask you, I think, two very tough questions. Not too tough, not personal, okay? Why should people care about Midway? Like, what are the seminal creations from Midway? And why don't people care about Midway?
Interesting. So, I think the thing that why they should care about Midway is that, this was a slice of time where games were being made that affected entertainment that came out later on. Mortal Kombat obviously is a huge property, but the way Mortal Kombat came out and the way the movie, they spawned a huge movie, and it just, led this whole revolution in terms of that style of video games. NBA Jam, in my opinion, out of all the games, NBA Jam was probably the biggest mainstream hit out there. I mean, you have people who don't even like playing video games still playing NBA Jam at arcades and stuff.
It's a 25-year anniversary of NBA Jam right now, too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, you got that, and even like sports graphics for the NFL got changed because of NFL Blitz. You know, so there are these little things that people think, hey, they're just video games, but really they were such huge hits that the people who played them later on went on to work for, let's say, the NFL and things like that.
Right.
And they changed the culture of things. And then, why do some people don't care for it? I think, Midway Games was so over the top on things. I mean, when your company is being talked about on Congress every night for a month, people will pigeonhole and say, hey, it's just video games. They're a bunch of idiots making violent video games,
right.
And they don't care for it. But one of the things that I touch on in the documentary is that it wasn't like everybody at the studio was all gung ho on doing violent stuff. I mean, there were some people that were very concerned about it. You look at the clip that was just shown, there was concern about that. And as silly as it may sound now, because it's all these low res graphics being violent, back then it was a big deal. And, some people were like, oh, who cares? People love it. And there were other people that were like, yeah, you know what? I have kids. I'm going to have a hard time explaining this to them, that I worked on this. So it goes around both sides.
Do you think that it was such a successful, especially the 90s, they were so successful that, and crossed over into popular culture in such a big way that it kind of got dated, like it had its moment and then pop culture moved. Like when you get to that sort of echelon, it's like you don't really worry about the way the rest of the industry is. You just worry about sort of being at that level. And then if tastes change, because they do, and you can't maintain that level, like maybe spending was so high or whatever, that like the moment passed and Midway just couldn't keep up with the moment kind of thing.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, there was always that risk of, it's like, hey, things have moved on. Should we keep trying to catch up? How do we keep upping the ante?
Yeah. And
sometimes it could end up looking like you're trying too hard.
Yeah.
So there were definitely, moments of some of the games like that. Like the over the top sports games. After a while, it was just like, well, you're gonna hit a ceiling eventually.
Yeah.
And how can you keep? But you can't always keep.
This is coming from a guy who made a Tony Hawk game.
Exactly.
Yes. Some tough lessons get learned, right? Like,
oh yeah.
And that's the thing, right? It is, you're chasing this moving target of what are people going to want to play, and you're trying to figure that out 2 years before they can play it, and it's not easy.
It's not easy, yeah. I mean, and as games got bigger and bigger, like in the arcade, it was one thing. In arcade, like the games would take less than a year to make. You would test it out in arcade and get feedback right away. Yeah. Nowadays, the bigger games, they take, at least a couple of years to make. Yeah, you're doing testing and things like that, but you really don't know. It's almost like baking a cake for 2 years. You don't know what's going to be like at the end. Yeah. And who knows, the taste of the culture might have changed by the time you're done. So you have no idea. It just gets so much tougher.
That's awesome. Do you have, obviously you're close to a lot of the titles that came out in the 90s, but I'm wondering if you've got a favorite, collection of Midway titles that people should play.
Oh, man. There's the obvious one. Like, out of the Mortal Kombat series, Mortal Kombat 2 is my favorite one. Mm-hmm. Out of the sports series, the NBA Showtime for me was my favorite basketball game. And
is that the one Vignacchi worked on?
Oh no, I think that was after. That
was Ballers.
The Ballers series.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Vignacchi, so funny you bring him up. Yeah. I'm actually gonna see him at GC.
He's everywhere.
Showtime was great because the last time we used to play Showtime a lot, and that was the one game that I would almost get violent about. Like I would get so pissed off, and like we would end up in almost in fist fights at the studio playing that game. So I love that game. Yeah. But yeah, it's I think those two are definitely the best for me.
What drove me to create Electric Playground, I've been playing games for, most of my life, and the 80s were very important to me. I still talk about Robotron all the time, and Defender and Sinistar and that stuff. It blows my mind that the guy that made Q*bert. That's
crazy.
That's incredible. Was there a recognition of the value of those creations and those people at Midway? Was there always sort of respect paid to people like Eugene Jarvis at the company?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's, like when I when I first walked in there, I was a huge '80s gamer also, so I knew these people, but I didn't know that they were still at Williams. And I remember my first day working, coming into Midway and meeting Jarvis, and my head just flipped.
Yeah.
I went into fanboy mode. John Newcomer, who created Joust, was still there.
Oh God.
Davis, well, Kubert obviously. So, but especially for Eugene Jarvis, I mean, he, really set the tone for the studio. He was basically running the game studio when he came back to Bunark, and so he set the tone for everything. It's and when you talk to any of the guys, like Boone, Termelin, any of the designers there, they will always defer to Eugene. They will always say that he's the godfather of video games. And there's an amazing amount of respect for him and for the other people also.
Yeah, there is something really unique about Eugene, because I remember I had an interview with him when I visited Midway, and I'm sure that he had that clout and that kind of role when I was there, but it wasn't sort of externalized. It wasn't something that was immediately available. He was just in his office and he was just low key about it, and he engaging and funny and passionate, but there was not this kind of, and maybe that's one of the things that kind of helped set the tone, is that he recognized the value in we're all in this together.
Yeah, no, he definitely set the tone on that. Like there was no airs about him. He was as goofy as anybody else. He was as much of a clown as anybody else. Cool. And I think when you see that the top guy acts that way, then everybody relaxes.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things that one of the things I learned when making a documentary is Ken Fedesna, who was heading up the studio at Midway in the '90s. He told me that, you got to remember, Eugene Jarvis is a genius. The guy is, he's super smart and things like that, and he will intentionally act a certain way to keep people at ease.
Right.
On things, but behind the scenes, man, he's like, his brain is always churning, and you hear stories from other programmers where they ask him to solve a problem, and he acts like he doesn't know, and just kind of acts goofy and stuff like that. Then he spits out the answer, instantly. And stuff.
That is amazing. And for those that don't know, Robotron and Defender. Robotron is like the first dual stick shooter game. Smash TV. He also developed, and Defender was seminal. And Eugene stayed in arcade. He also did the Cruisin' series and worked with Nintendo and all of that stuff. But he runs a company called Raw Thrills. Is he still making arcade games to this day?
They are I think they're the biggest American arcade company. If you go to a Dave & Buster's or any of these family fun centers, if video game wise, not the redemption games, but the video games, I bet you 75% of the machines are from his company.
That's great.
Just hugely successful.
That is awesome. When you were making this documentary, and you're showing it off, I think, in public for the first time next week, right, at the Game Developers Conference?
Yeah.
Am I right about that? Congrats. Was there a moment when you were shooting, or maybe in post when you were putting it all together, where you went, "Oh my God, this is why I'm doing this"? Was there one of those, or were there? Can you sort of take us into that moment?
Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, I had so many of those moments come up, and it wasn't, any one part of the story or anything like that. What would come up is it was almost like this Rashomon thing where one person tells a story, then I hear it from another point of view.
Oh, cool.
And they contradict each other. And moments like that, I love it because it's kind of everything is so subjective.
Yes.
So things like that was really exciting. But I think the biggest rushes I would get is when I find a piece of archival material that jives with something somebody said.
Yeah.
And it's almost like it's like being Indiana Jones of video games, where you find this piece of video that nobody's ever seen before, and it's in pristine condition, and it illustrates something that somebody talked about. And so stuff if I could do it, I would just work on this forever and make a giant 12-hour thing, because I have so much material to go through.
Yeah.
And I think that's been one of the most painful things about the project is, maybe 15% of it is going to be seen, because ultimately it has to be, an entertaining 2-hour film.
Yeah.
But there's just so much to go over because there's just so many great stories, to tell.
Well, Josh, I think this is going to be the beginning of something wonderful, and I applaud your work. Ever since you announced this, you and I have followed each other on Twitter, and I've seen all your tweets, and I know how passionate you are about this industry and about this beautiful company that I hope people dive in and learn more. It breaks my heart that I just announced the Sega Genesis collection today. That's coming out pretty soon, and we talk about all of this flashback kind of content all the time, but here is this bevy of material that is sort of splintered across a lot of rights holders right now. The EA owns some and Warner Brothers owns some, and we just don't new Robotrons would be amazing, or new collections of Midway games would be amazing. A new variation on Joust. I think maybe Ready Player One, because there was a lot of Midway, threaded through the story, and hopefully I haven't seen the movie yet, but maybe that will start to get people excited. I did dig the Lego Midway arcade games thing that they did with Lego Dimensions. Did you check that out? Did you ever get it?
I saw that. That was amazing.
Yes.
Yeah. So somebody coordinated the rights to it. So there is hope.
Yeah, I really hope so. Well, your work and work about communicating about this, and also everybody that's watching this and has dug a Midway game in the past. They did get some cheesy ones in there. I remember they tried to bring back Narc, and it was kind of like this weird over-the-top Miami Vice-y, but super violent, and nobody really dug that one. But there is so much to dig into, and I can't wait to see this thing finished. Good luck at GDC showing this off to people. I can't wait to read some of the tweets and the people talking about it, and I can't wait to see this when this is all done, my friend.
Thank you so much, Victor. Yeah, and definitely, if anybody's interested on getting on the mailing list to get up to date on things, because more and more material is starting to come out, go to insertcoindoc.com, and you'll start getting a lot more info in the coming months.
Awesome. This is Josh Tsui, filmmaker, making us an awesome documentary about Midway.